So when we're looking at some of the pre-1900s poetry, we need to look at what metaphysical poetry is. When we're studying John Donne and Andrew Marvell, we need to bear in mind the characteristics of metaphysical poetry. So in this short little video and couple videos, we're going to be looking at what is metaphysical poetry, what are the characteristics, so that you can try and identify them when you are analysing John Donne and Andrew Marvell's poetry. So let's look at definitions first. What is metaphysics? So metaphysics is a branch of philosophy dealing with the relationship between mind and matter. In other words, the mind and the physical world. So when you start looking at The Flea and Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, we need to think about, well, what is the relationship between the mind and the physical world? How has that influenced John Donne and Andrew Marvell? So first, metaphysical poetry is about the transcendental and supernatural, what is beyond the physical. Now, John Donne is seen as one of the most famous metaphysical poets. Andrew Marvell was influenced by John Donne and is also classed as a metaphysical poet. Now, interestingly, the term metaphysical poetry, which is ascribed to British and European poets during the 17th century, wasn't actually intended as a name, a categorization we use for poetry. It was actually coined by a man called Samuel Johnson, who was a literary critic and lived between 1709 and 1784. Now, it was actually used as an insult. It wasn't actually used as something to celebrate. But, interestingly, it has been adopted, and one of the characteristics we're going to see in Andrew Donne and John Donne and Andrew Marvell's poetry is a specific concern with life and death. So going back to transcendental and supernatural, what is beyond the physical, so the physical world, we are going to be seeing things that are related to the supernatural or transcendental, so what goes beyond, what transcends our natural life. And that's very important for the language that these poets use, how they structure their poems, but also how they put across a point. Now, let's look at some characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Now, one of the most important vocabulary words that you need to know is the word conceits. So conceits are inventive metaphors, analogies, or similes, and they're often surprising or unusual. And these are incredibly important to metaphysical poetry because when you're looking at what these poets have written, there will be times where you go, sorry, what? How have they likened these two things together? It's just completely unexpected, even in our modern times. And they make inventive or unusual comparisons. So this is also, there's links to this idea of conceits, the inventiveness of the language. And I guess when you're looking at these poems, because it will be surprising, the times where you go, I don't get that, well, that seems completely unrelated, make a note of that and think, well, why is it unusual? Why was it surprising? And how is it inventive? And how does that help me understand the meaning in these poems? Now, when it comes to subject matter, the subject matter of the poems is concerned with life, death, and souls even after death. And it comes about in various different ways. When you're looking at these different poems, we'll be doing a little bit of comparison, I think, as we go through. And when we look at subjects of life and death, we can think, well, what effect did it have on these poets and why do they include it? Then poems are usually witty, obscure, and learning is the main objective. So yes, this idea of wit, something obscure, something strange. Now, poets we could argue, were competing against each other to come up with the best poem. And we can think, well, are these poets competing with each other? Or are they just trying to use language in a different way? And if learning is the main objective, what is supposed to be learnt? These poems also often present an argument, and we'll see that as we go through the poems. There is a logic to the stanzas. There is a premise that's being put forward and then argued. We have often a speaker who is trying to persuade you of something. Now, is the speaker trying to persuade the audience, we as the listeners, the readers, or is there someone else in the poem that is trying to be persuaded of something? And this idea of dual meanings will come up a lot. And then also what was different about metaphysical poetry is this colloquial language, in other words, everyday language. So it wasn't written in big, grand overtures, lots of huge vocabulary words. It was written in everyday speech. And this is interesting because they wanted to make it understandable. And we can think, well, if they changed the language to be more formal, would it have changed the meaning? And here, just some useful links, or a useful link that I found very useful when doing some research on metaphysical poetry. So if you'd like to do some more reading, this is a very good definition and summary of metaphysical poetry.